Now it's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Last week, US President Joe Biden held a virtual summit hosting more than 100 world leaders, civil society activists and journalists to discuss and renew shared values and resolve to strengthen democracy amid a rise of authoritarianism around the globe. But as the US leader admitted, democracy starts at home and recent years have been a challenging time for societies. Before and after the summit, critics have questioned whether the summit would motivate governments to get back on track or simply cause more division in the world. And to discuss this, we connect with Jae-chun Kim, professor at Sogang University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Mark Shanahan, associate professor in politics and international relations at the University of Reading. A warm welcome to you both. And well, to begin with you, Professor Kim, the Summit for Democracy held last week, it faced criticism before it even opened, with the guest list being quite controversial. It included the likes of Brazil, India, and the Philippines, whose leaders have arguably caused democracy to backslide in recent years. And well, despite the criticism though, what was the reason that President Biden held the summit and invited these rather controversial guests?
Sure. There was criticism, as you said. There are just too many countries that don't really qualify as being democratic. You just mentioned Brazil, India, and the Philippines, but still you can say that these countries are at least partly democratic. But Angola was invited, so was Congo. In my personal opinion, these countries are not democratic at all. And in case of Eastern Europe, Poland was in, but Hungary was out. So a lot of people are scratching their heads. What's the criteria here? It's just too arbitrary. But I think you'll have to look at it this way, because the status of democracy in the world is very precarious. Democracy is in retreat all around the world, and this is quite alarming, because in the early 1990s, when the Cold War was over, the world had witnessed what is known as third wave of democratization. Many countries went through democratization. In the early 2000s, we had another wave of democracy. There is Arab Spring, but since then, democracy has been in decline. The number of democracies is in decline, and the quality of democracy is decline. And this doesn't really bode well for President Biden, who wants to resuscitate the liberal democratic order, liberal international order. So in a way, Biden, I think, is trying to steer these quasi-democracies and illiberal democracies into the path of more stable and mature democratization. That said, I still think that the criticism is very valid. You look at the list of these countries, you feel that Biden was selling democracy short.
And well, Professor Kim, few expected Russia or China to make the list, but they did seem a bit offended all the same. Do you think the holding of the summit is going to deepen America's rift with these countries?
Oh, absolutely. China and Russia, they just didn't take it very well. In fact, China issued a white paper. I forgot the name of the paper, but there China claims that China has its own political system, which is democratic. It's just different from the Western participatory or electoral democracy. Well, Soo-young, we just talked about the decline of democracy, right? Many believe that the decline of democracy has a lot to do with the rise of China and the relative decline of the United States. China is not mounting ideological campaign to spread authoritarianism as the Soviet Union did to spread communism all around the world. But I think China is still trying to make the world safe for autocracies. China is trying to make the world where autocrats and autocracies feel legitimate or even privileged. And the U.S., on its own part, lost interests in its policy to promote democracy. This trend was quite noticeable during the presidency of Donald Trump. So I think Biden wants to right the ship here. He wants to change the course. He wants to change course. He's trying to, take care of democracy at home, and he's also trying to bring more democracies together. And this is a very efficient way to deal with the threats associated with the rise of China.
Well, Professor Shanahan, now, before Britain hosted the extended G7 meeting in June, it also proposed initiatives to strengthen democracy, such as the D10 group. The integrated review as well, it also commits to spreading democracy in the world. And then, of course, next year, there's the Copenhagen Democracy Summit coming up in June. So with these various initiatives, what was the purpose of President Biden hosting his own democracy summit?
Yeah, we do like bandying around the term democracy, and Western leaders, and Biden as a relatively new president definitely wants to get behind this. And it has been a terrible year. The last couple of years have been a terrible time for democracy. We look at the Freedom Index and see far more countries slipping back towards autocracy than actually moving towards democracy. Not helped at all by 4 years of Donald Trump, where the US just abdicated its global leadership. So I would say Biden had three aims with this meeting that he held last week. First of all, to push back against autocracy. We know he'd had long calls with Putin, that he's had contact with Xi in China, trying to establish relations with them, but also to make it very clear to them that no longer were they free to act as they wanted to without America pushing back, interfering, getting involved. So that was aim number one. Aim number two was just to re-establish that United States leadership within international relations. It's been abdicated for too long. Biden, frankly, hasn't had a very good year of it himself. And now he is trying to do something of a reset with a group of countries that he feels America can have influence with. This is why it was a relatively select group. And finally, don't forget the midterms are not far off in America. He is also talking to a domestic audience at home. The January 6th insurrection is being investigated through congressional hearings at the moment. Here is a president who wants to be seen to be standing up for democracy, completely at odds and opposite to his predecessor.
Professor Shanahan, Mr. Biden, he also intends to hold a second summit of democracies next year. And while critics have said that this summit, the first one, is really going to intensify division rather than strengthen unity among democratic countries, what's your opinion on this?
I think there has to be action that comes from this first summit. Whether it be G7, G20, all of these other meetings that we've heard an awful lot of this year, there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. So if there are concrete plans that come from the United States, which is putting a lot of money into this initiative, if we see them play out in Africa, in Asia, in South America, even in Poland, Hungary, Slovenia, those countries that are backtracking on democracy in Europe, then a second summit will be justified. They can't go back to beginnings and talk about all of the nice things that they like to do. They have to show through participation that action is happening that is strengthening democracy. If it doesn't, it raises the case, maybe for the alternative view, as Professor Kim has already alluded to, of the kind of benign autocracy that China would like to promote. Now, is China's move, is Russia's move, is it benign autocracy? Is it for the benefit of the Commonwealth of Nations, or is it something a little more totalitarian and a little more favoring those one or two countries? Biden would like to have a much stronger network of democracies that start pushing the Freedom Index in the right direction again. And to do that, he has to counter, frankly, the attraction of China.
And well, Professor Kim, in terms of getting more countries on Washington's side in its rivalry with Beijing, do you think the emphasis on democracy as a foreign policy is going to work well for the United States? I mean, especially among countries in ASEAN.
But I think the U.S. is in dilemmatic situation here. The democracy and human rights are important parts of Biden's value democracy, right? And democracy and human rights are China's source parts, and you want to exploit them. And at the same time, you want to bring as many countries as you can to your side in this fight against China, right? And the most important battleground in this U.S.-China competition is over Southeast Asia, over ASEAN countries. I think these are real battleground states, and then China has an overwhelming advantage here because of geographical proximity. So in order for the United States to prevail in Southeast Asia, it's very important for the U.S. to win the hearts and minds of ASEAN countries. And therein lies the dilemma for the United States, because if you push democracy and human rights too far, you're not going to win the hearts and minds of ASEAN countries, because many ASEAN countries have dismal record of democracy and human rights, to be honest with you. And if you ignore democracy and human rights in your policy to ASEAN, if you remain silent about human rights issues and democracy issues in ASEAN, people will say that Biden's value democracy is selective in nature. Biden's value democracy goes to China, but it stops in ASEAN countries. So Biden, I think, will really have to somehow navigate the middle ground here. That's my take.
Well, Professor Kim, the US, of course, it's been pushing for countries to come up with these deliverables before the second summit next year. And it announced the presidential initiative for democratic renewal, and then it also joined hands with the likes of Australia, Denmark and Norway to announce this export control program. And that's designed to ensure that technology isn't used to violate human rights. And well, according to the Voice of America, the United States government is giving other countries until January to make their own pledges and wants to see progress on such deliverables. What is the reason for this kind of pressure?
Well, to me, I think there is very little doubt that the U.S. had China in mind when they floated this idea. It's no secret that CCP is utilizing all sorts of surveillance technologies to monitor Uyghurs in Xinjiang and to monitor even ordinary citizens in China. Simply put, there is no free flow of information in China, no freedom of speech. And this information and communication technology has become an important policy tool of CCP. In Xinjiang, as I said, spyware, all these technologies are now the most important tools to abuse the most basic rights of Uyghurs, including the right to move freely in their own country. To me, it's quite alarming because when the internet and smartphone and SNS, when they started to spread like bushfire all around the world, we believe that ICT, information and communication technology, would empower people over the government, because people now have instant access to this important information and share it with others, virtually real time. However, in many authoritarian countries, ICT, information and communication technology, has worked to the advantage of these authoritarian regimes. These regimes that are gagging freedom of speech. And we'll have to put an end to this, really. So that I think that is the reason why Biden and other democracies are launching this export control regime thing together to restrict the spread of technologies that are being used to abuse human rights.
Professor Shanahan, Mr. Biden raised the issue of electoral systems, and the summit closed with a focus on strengthening cooperation on export control and human rights, and to ensure that technology doesn't fall into the hands of authoritarian governments. And while keeping government systems free and democratic and representative is very important, we're also seeing the rise of the growing presence, rather, of big tech companies, as well as the worsening income levels, disproportionate income levels. Some would say that these are more direct threats to democracies. Do you think these issues should be addressed in any upcoming discussions?
It's very notable that this first dialogue that Biden brought together included some big tech companies. These companies in themselves have economies larger than many of the countries that took place in this summit. A company like Facebook turns over more than almost half of the states in the world. We can't live without them. The problem is that they're run by unelected boards, that founders of any of these companies have had free rein for rather a long time to build their own systems, their own platforms, their own governance that is largely untouched by the governments of countries where they operate. That balance is wrong at the moment. And it goes hand in hand with this systematic situation we have at the moment where the rich are getting exponentially richer and the poor aren't. They aren't getting any better off at all. Now, actually, the kind of democracy envisaged coming out of the Second World War with the institutions of the World Bank, the IMF, and all of the rest were built upon a foundation of United Nations that worked together for mutual benefit, where the wealthy countries of the world raised up those who were less wealthy. It could be that the big tech companies enable that to happen. But at the moment, we're not necessarily seeing that. And that remains in itself a danger to the further spread of democracy.
Well, it looks like democracies have a long way to go to get back on track. But for today, we're going to have to end the discussion here. That was Jae-chun Kim, Professor at Sogang University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Mark Shanahan, Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.